My name is Daniel Mercer, and on the morning everything happened, I believed I understood the Bradshaw Mountains better than anyone my age had any right to. I was 24, a recent graduate in environmental surveying, and I had spent the last month mapping unofficial trails around central Arizona for a small conservation group. I mention this because I want you to understand that I wasn't inexperienced, careless, or unfamiliar with the terrain when my friend Mason dragged me into the worst day of my life. I knew what a mine shaft looked like. I knew how unstable antique ironwood supports could become after a century of moisture and thermal expansion. And I knew, better than most, that the Bradshaws hide more forgotten holes in the earth than anyone has ever managed to officially document. That makes what happened next feel all the more preventable and all the more unforgivable. The day started at Mason's grandfather's house, a small, sun-bleached place on the outskirts of Mayer, flanked by creosote scrub and a rattling wire fence that looked like it hadn't been tightened since the 70s. We were supposed to head up one of the old service roads near Bumblebee to check for campsite erosion. I had my pack ready, the topographic sheets printed, the GPS calibrated. When Mason stepped out onto the porch, he looked fine. Tired, maybe, but eager, bouncing his keys in his hand like we were about to go out for beers instead of spending a day hiking under an unforgiving sun. His grandfather, though, met us at the screen door before we could leave. The man was 82, broad-shouldered in the way old miners sometimes are, with hands that looked dusted permanently with red clay. His voice carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime underground, rasping through old dust. "You boys stay off that old shaft," he said without preamble. Not hello, not good morning, just that. "You hear me?" Mason rolled his eyes. "Gramps, we're not going near the mine." "Which one?" his grandfather demanded, stepping closer so quickly the door slapped behind him. "Name it." Mason blinked, clearly thrown. The one off the ridge above Silver Creek? That ain't the one I'm talking about." His grandfather's jaw tightened. "I mean the real one. The one no one's supposed to know is there." The way he said it unsettled me more than I want to admit. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't spooky. It was blunt, like a man issuing a workplace safety warning. I asked, calmly, where exactly this shaft was located. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he stared at both of us as though he were trying to decide whether we were capable of listening. "You'll know you're close," he finally said, "because the ground don't sit right. You'll feel it sinking under you, like it's hollow. And if you hear anything at all, you turn around and walk back the way you came. Don't go looking for the mouth. Don't try to figure out where it is. Just leave." Mason laughed it off, muttering something about old miners and old ghost stories. But I didn't. My work had already put me near more collapsed exploratory tunnels than I could count. It was true that the Bradshaws were riddled with undocumented dig sites from the 1870s silver rush. If his grandfather knew of one that wasn't on any map, it could be lethal. Soil crust over an open void can collapse under a single step. Still, the intensity of the warning stayed in the back of my mind as we loaded our gear into Mason's aging Tacoma and started the climb toward the ridge road. The sun was already hot, shimmering over the asphalt as we left the last sign of town behind. Saguaros stood like silent sentinels along the hillside, and the smell of heated creosote drifted through the open windows. Mason was chatty, upbeat, but there was a tightness in his jaw I recognized from old arguments he used to have with his grandfather. They never fought about politics or chores like most families. They fought about secrets, about the mountains, about things Mason wasn't allowed to know. Halfway up the service road, the pavement turned to dirt and the switchbacks became steeper. We parked at a pullout shaded by a lone juniper, grabbed our packs, and started up the faint trail we were supposed to survey. It should have been a straightforward hike, 3 miles out, 3 back, with markers every half mile. The kind of assignment I could do half asleep. But within the first 20 minutes, something felt off. The ground really did feel wrong in places. Not dramatically, no soft spots, no visible sink lines, but there were sections where the ground subtly flexed underfoot, like walking on packed ash rather than solid granite. At first I told myself it was just the natural settling of alluvial soil sliding off the steeper grade, but the sensation kept returning in small patches, irregular and widely spaced. After a while, Mason noticed me pausing to test the ground with my boot and asked what I was doing. I told him. He shrugged and said, "Maybe that's what Gramps meant." But the way he said it wasn't casual. It was careful, like he wasn't sure whether to joke or worry. The higher we climbed, the quieter the mountains became. Even the insects seemed to thin out. The air tasted like warm dust. And at one point, around noon, judging by the sun, I realized neither of us had spoken for several minutes. We were moving faster than the trail required, both of us subconsciously hurrying. When the sound finally came, it was so faint I thought I imagined it. A muffled thud, like a distant door closing underground. I stopped. Mason walked 2 more steps before turning back. "You heard that too, right?" I asked. He nodded, slowly, his brows pinched together. And somewhere beneath our feet, the earth gave a subtle, hollow groan. The groan lasted less than a second, but it traveled through the soil in a way that made my stomach drop, like standing on the thin shell of a drum. I shifted my weight back, instinctively bracing for the ground to give way. It didn't, but something under the surface settled with a muted, gritty sigh. Mason stepped closer, testing the spot with the edge of his boot. I hissed at him to stop, too sharply, but he froze without arguing. That alone scared me more than the sound itself. Mason never took my warnings seriously. We backed off to firmer terrain, moving slowly until we returned to a patch where the granite rose nearer the surface. The difference was immediate. The ground felt solid again, anchored. My pulse steadied. Mason exhaled shakily and wiped sweat from his brow, although the heat wasn't what had put it there. "Gramps knew something," he murmured, not quite looking at me. "He really did. Old miners usually do," I said, but that didn't explain the dread sitting in my chest like a stone. I crouched and brushed aside a thin layer of loose red dust, feeling for any fracture lines. Nothing obvious. If there was a void beneath us, it wasn't a small one. The sound we'd heard had the depth of a massive chamber, not a short exploratory tunnel or a shallow air pocket. The trail markers told us we were already off our mapped line by a few hundred feet. Not technically dangerous, but unusual. I checked the GPS. It pinged normally, but for some reason the satellite overlay looked slightly stretched, like the topo grid had been pulled taut on one side. I blinked, assuming glare. When I looked again, it was fine. I told myself it had to be heat distortion. We should have turned back, and in hindsight I can't justify why we didn't. I think part of me wanted to prove the ground stable. Part of me wanted to finish the job. And part of me, if I'm being brutally honest, wanted to know why Mason's grandfather had been so afraid. Fear wrapped in secrecy is dangerous in a landscape like the Bradshaws. Secrets get people killed. We continued uphill, weaving around boulders and darkened stretches of mesquite where the shade felt strangely cold compared to the open trail. The silence deepened. Even the wind seemed to bypass the ridge, moving around us instead of through it. Every now and then Mason would glance at me, searching for any sign that we were both imagining it. We weren't. About 40 minutes later, the trail shifted sharply left along a narrow outcropping. To the right, the slope dropped into a shallow ravine choked with low scrub, and the heat pooled there in a stagnant wave. Ahead, the ridge rose in uneven layers of weathered shale. We were supposed to mark erosion points along the shale face. That had been the whole reason for the survey. But as soon as we rounded the first bend, my stomach clenched. There were no erosion points. There was no shale face at all. The entire section of trail had subtly reoriented itself in a way that didn't match my printed topo sheet. It wasn't supernatural, just wrong. The land didn't match the map. A slope rose where the contour lines showed a decline. A scatter of boulders blocked an area that should have been open. And in the center of it all, half obscured by tall brittlebush, lay a depression in the ground. Not a hole, not a collapsed entrance. A depression, a gentle circular dip maybe 10 feet across, so faint it could have been mistaken for natural settling, except the soil around it had a strange texture, almost smoother. I recognized it instantly, because I'd seen the pattern once before near an old collapsed silver shaft in Montana. When the roof of a deep tunnel slowly sinks over decades, the ground above forms what surveyors call a subsidence bowl, a gentle sag where the earth is thinning, a warning sign. Mason saw my expression and his face drained. "Is that?" "Yeah," I said. "It's a void. A big one." He swallowed. "The one Gramps meant?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to be right. We approached carefully, keeping to the perimeter where the soil felt firmer. I crouched, pressing my palm to the earth. Even through my glove, it felt too warm, like the sun had baked that spot far hotter than the surrounding ground. But the bush shadows covered much of it, meaning it shouldn't have been heated evenly. I pulled my hand back, unnerved. "Don't get closer," I said, standing. "We mark the location, take a waypoint, and report it. That's it." But Mason was staring past me. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I held my breath. First, nothing. But then, yes, faint, rhythmic vibration. Not sound exactly, more like movement. Something far below, shifting in a slow pulse. Earth settling, maybe, or supports creaking. But the cadence was too steady, like something swinging lightly on a rope or chain. I stepped back fast, grabbing Mason's arm. "Off this ridge. Now." We retreated in controlled steps, careful not to cross the sagging center. When we reached firmer rock, we both exhaled shakily. My chest felt tight, like the air had been tainted with the knowledge of what lay beneath. Mason's voice was barely audible. "If there's a shaft under there, how deep do you think it is?" "Deep enough we shouldn't be anywhere near it." He nodded, but his eyes were fixed behind me. When I turned, I saw why. 30 yards downslope, where the ravine edge met the dense scrub, the brush had been shifted. Not trampled, not clawed, shifted. Like something wide had been dragged through it recently. A clean, low path of flattened vegetation leading toward the base of the subsidence bowl. But there were no footprints, no animal tracks, no tire marks, no indication of what made the path. Just a drag line perfectly straight. "We didn't come up that way," Mason said. "Did we?" "No." "Then what did?" I didn't have an answer, but as I studied the flattened brush, I noticed something else. The path didn't start at the ravine. It ended there. The indentation grew deeper the closer it came to the depression in the earth, as if whatever had made it had been pulled underground. The air felt suddenly colder despite the afternoon heat. Mason backed up until he bumped into me, his breath catching. And then, from deep beneath the ground, far deeper than the earlier thud, came a distant metallic clink. Not random, not settling. A single, deliberate tap, like someone striking iron. Once, waiting for a reply. The metallic tap echoed through the ground with a clarity that didn't make sense at that depth. Sharp enough that I felt it in my knees rather than in my ears. Mason jerked like he'd been shocked and took several steps back, but I grabbed his pack strap and steadied him. The slope behind us was loose gravel. One slip and he'd tumble straight toward the depression. He seemed to register this at the same moment I did, because his breathing turned shallow, almost panicked. "That wasn't settling," he whispered. "No," I said. "It wasn't." We stood frozen, waiting, listening. The silence between us grew so thick it felt like the air had been stripped of oxygen. I counted my breaths, grounding myself the way they taught us in field training, until my pulse slowed enough for me to think clearly. I needed to get us off that ridge, away from the subsidence bowl, away from whatever had just signaled from beneath the earth. I motioned for Mason to follow me along the rockier portion of the slope, staying close to the juniper clusters where the roots likely anchored the soil more firmly. We moved slowly, deliberately, testing each footprint before shifting our weight. The sun pressed down without mercy, baking the granite ledges until heat radiated off them in shimmering waves. Sweat trickled down my back beneath my pack, soaking into my shirt. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the depression to widen, or the earth to sink, or some shape to rise from the drag-mark path leading straight into it. But nothing moved, nothing changed. The mountains around us remained eerily still, too quiet for mid-afternoon. Even the cicadas were absent. When we reached a wider shelf of granite, I allowed us to stop. Mason bent over, hands on his knees, trying to steady his breathing. He wasn't out of shape, he was scared. And the thing about fear in the desert is that it lands differently than in a forest. There's nowhere for it to hide. Nowhere for you to hide. The open sky gives your mind too much room to imagine what's crawling under the earth. I checked the GPS again, hoping to confirm our position, but the screen flickered. It wasn't losing signal, satellite reception was fine. It was as if the topographical projection jittered against itself, slightly offset by a fraction of a degree each time it refreshed. A mismatch between where the unit thought we were and what it was seeing. I'd only seen this once, years ago, near an unstable hillside that later collapsed after a heavy monsoon season. I tapped Mason's shoulder. "We're heading back. Slowly. Stay on the rock whenever possible." He nodded and for once didn't argue. We started descending the same trail we'd climbed up, though the path felt unfamiliar now, the slope steeper, the scrub thicker. The quiet had changed too. It wasn't just silence, it was pressure, a heaviness in the air, as if the weight of the mountain had shifted and was now leaning toward us. Halfway down the ridge, we reached another patch of soil that flexed under my boot. A small patch, inches only, but I froze anyway. Mason didn't notice and walked 2 paces ahead, until the ground under him let out a faint, hollow thwomp. He leapt back instinctively, nearly colliding with me. We both stared at the spot. It wasn't a full sink, just a subtle yield. But the sound, it wasn't the soft collapse of shallow dirt. It was deeper, resonant, like the muffled echo of a cavernous space. Mason stopped moving. "Look at me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're walking along the roof of something big. If we take the wrong route—" "I know," he said sharply, panic tightening his voice. "I know, okay?" I didn't respond. I crouched and extended my trekking pole, pressing the tip lightly into the soil. It sank half an inch too easily, then stopped against harder material. Timber? Stone? I didn't press harder. Puncturing a weak crust could trigger a collapse. We circled around the soft patch, staying close to the exposed bedrock. The trail was faint here, more suggestion than path, and I realized how easy it would have been for hikers to wander straight into the sagging earth without realizing it. If Mason's grandfather had known about this place, he'd probably spent years worrying someone would die here. By the time we reached the juniper where we'd parked earlier that morning, my legs felt shaky with relief. The truck sat exactly where we'd left it, shimmering in the heat, looking so normal and so outrageously out of place after what we'd just walked across. Mason fumbled with his keys but finally got the doors unlocked. I loaded my pack into the bed, then leaned against the side of the truck for a moment, letting the adrenaline bleed off. Mason got into the driver's seat but didn't start the engine. His hands were gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. I opened the passenger door but paused before getting in. "We need to report this," I said quietly. "Not just to your grandfather. To the land management office. Someone needs to mark that trail off, fence it, something." Mason nodded but didn't look at me. Instead, he stared through the windshield toward the slope we just descended, his jaw tight. Finally, he spoke. "Danny, I think Gramps wasn't warning us about the mine." I frowned. What else would he be warning us about? He swallowed, then pointed toward the brush line 50 feet ahead of the truck. The drag path was there too, clear as day, fresh, as if something massive had been hauled or had hauled itself across the scrub straight toward where we'd parked. The flattened vegetation glinted under the sun, the line so direct it looked unnatural. The track ended at a patch of disturbed soil no more than a yard from the front bumper. Mason's voice cracked. "It wasn't there when we parked." "No," I whispered. "It wasn't. And, Danny," he pointed again, his hand trembling. Something about the disturbed soil had changed since we walked down the ridge. It wasn't just compressed. It was sunken, a narrow, slanted indentation, as if something had pressed upward from below before retreating again. The imprint was shallow, an inch or two maybe, but shaped unmistakably like a hand. Not human-sized, bigger, much bigger. Mason slammed the locks. I got into the truck without another word. But before he could start the engine, the ground beneath the chassis gave a faint, unmistakable metallic tap. Once, right under us. The tap came from directly under the center of the truck, sharp enough that both of us jolted upright. Mason's hand hovered over the ignition but didn't turn it. The engine suddenly felt like a gamble, like vibration might be the one thing that pushed whatever was beneath us into motion. My lungs felt too small for the air I was dragging in. Sweat rolled down my neck, collecting in the collar of my shirt, but my hands were ice cold. "Start it," I whispered. "I don't want to hit it," Mason murmured back, voice cracking. What if it's right under us? What if the tires?" "Mason, start the truck." He turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, vibrating the chassis. For a second, nothing happened. Then the ground beneath the passenger side dipped. Barely half an inch, but enough that I felt the shift through the seat. Mason yelped and threw the truck into reverse so fast the gears clicked. Gravel spat out from the tires, the rear end sliding slightly before catching. We lurched backward onto firmer ground, dust kicking up in a thick cloud. "Go!" I shouted. "Just go!" He slammed the accelerator. The Tacoma fishtailed, then surged forward down the rocky service road, suspension jolting under us. The mirrors rattled. My teeth rattled. We descended the first switchback so fast I had to brace myself against the dash to keep from sliding sideways. The ridge loomed behind us in the rearview mirror, shrinking with every turn, but my breath didn't ease. The mountains felt alive in a way terrain shouldn't. Every shadow looked too dark. Every boulder felt like a watcher. I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see movement, a shape, a shifting in the brush, something following. At the third switchback, we hit a patch of washboard road so violently the entire truck bounced. The glove compartment flew open, scattering old registration slips across my feet. Mason cursed and fought the wheel. The Tacoma steadied, but the moment it did, the thud came again. Not from below, from behind us, on the road. A dull, heavy impact, like something massive had dropped onto the dirt. Mason nearly clipped a manzanita bush in his panic to look into the rearview mirror. I grabbed his shoulder, forcing him to watch the road. Eyes forward. Don't look back. Just drive. He obeyed, but tears were welling from the tension in his eyes. He wasn't crying in fear, he was overwhelmed, like an electrical wire pulled too tight. I knew the feeling. My own hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep my grip steady on the door handle. Nothing else hit the road, but the silence behind the truck felt charged, oppressive, as if the mountains themselves were listening. We reached the end of the service road faster than should have been mechanically possible. The moment tires hit the asphalt, Mason floored it again, the Tacoma roaring down the two-lane descent toward Mayer. The valley opened ahead of us, wide and blisteringly bright under the afternoon sun. But I couldn't shake the sense that something had come up from beneath that ridge, that something now knew us, knew our steps, our weight, our heat, knew we'd heard it. Halfway down the road, Mason slammed the brakes so suddenly that my seatbelt locked across my chest. The truck skidded to a stop, dust spiraling around us. "What are you doing?" I gasped. He pointed out the passenger window with a shaking hand. At first I saw nothing but desert, saguaros, rocks, pale dirt. Then my eyes landed on a patch of ground near a fence line, maybe 30 yards from the pavement. The earth there had sagged, a small, fresh depression, circular, too similar to the subsidence bowl higher up the ridge. Except this one hadn't been there that morning, and it hadn't formed naturally. The edges were too sharp, the soil too recently shifted. Something had compressed it from beneath the surface, recently, violently, directly. "Our house is 10 minutes that way," Mason whispered. "Gramps' place, my mom's. They're all right down this road." The meaning hit me like a hammer. Whatever was beneath that mountain wasn't trapped there. And it wasn't random. It followed paths of stress, of movement, of weight. If it had followed the drag path to the truck, if it had pressed upward beneath us, if it had landed on the road behind us, then it could follow pressure, sound, vibration, disturbance, could follow us. "Mason," I said slowly, "we need to think." He turned toward me like a man expecting a death sentence. "Think about what? What are we supposed to do? Call the sheriff and say the dirt is tapping? That there's something in the mine that isn't supposed to be there? They'll say we're sunstruck." "They won't when they see the ground," I said. "And your grandfather, he knows something. He's known for years." "Exactly," Mason snapped, his voice breaking. "He knew and he never told me. Not what it was. Not why. If he knew, he should have warned us better. He should have." He stopped mid-sentence. A vibration trembled through the asphalt beneath us. Slow, faint, rhythmic. Not the truck. Not traffic. Not wind. From the earth. From below the road. I reached down instinctively and touched the floorboard with my fingertips. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. A weak but steady pulse, like the aftershock of something tunneling far beneath us. Not moving fast, just repositioning. Mason whispered, "Danny, we're not safe anywhere on this mountain. We have to get to your grandfather," I said. "He knows where we can stand, where it can't reach. Old miners always know. There's solid bedrock somewhere near his property. There has to be." He swallowed, wiped his eyes, and forced himself to breathe. Then he put the truck back into gear, hands steadier than before, and eased us back onto the road. Not speeding this time, not panicking, but moving with deliberate purpose. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The Bradshaw Mountains rose behind us. The ridge we'd walked a jagged silhouette against the hard Arizona sky. I watched it in the side mirror, expecting no fearing, to see a plume of dust, a shifting of soil, a collapse, a rising. But the ridge sat still, too still. When we turned toward the outskirts of Mayer, Mason's grandfather's house finally came into view. and my gut twisted immediately, because the old man was already outside, standing in the middle of the yard, not waiting, watching, staring up the road at us like he'd known the exact second we realized the truth. And then I saw his expression, grim, resigned, and terrified, and I understood. He hadn't warned us to keep away from the mine. He'd warned us because once something knew you'd found it, it never stayed underground. Mason pulled the Tacoma into the dirt driveway slower than I'd ever seen him drive. His grandfather didn't move. He stood like the heat didn't touch him, like his boots were anchored to the earth itself. His eyes were locked on us with an intensity that made my throat tighten. The yard around him was still, too still. No wind through the creosote, no shifting dust, not even a bird cutting across the sky. It was as if the mountain had exhaled and the world was holding its breath. When we rolled to a stop, Mason didn't immediately get out. Neither did I. For a second we just sat there, hands still gripping whatever we'd grabbed during the drive. His the wheel, mine the door handle. Finally, Mason pushed the door open and stepped into the sun. His grandfather's voice came low and sharp, carrying across the yard like gravel dragged across concrete. "What did you do? Not what happened. Not are you hurt. What did you do?" Mason froze. "Gramps, something's happening in the mountains, something underground." "We didn't. You went near it." The old man took one step forward, fists clenched at his sides. "I told you never to go near that place. I told you not to step anywhere close." His gaze snapped to me. "Did you hear the ground?" I nodded once. "We heard more than that." His jaw tightened. Deep lines carved themselves into his face as he looked between us, calculating, bracing, regretting. Then, with a sharp gesture, he pointed toward the house. "Inside, now, and move lightly, lightly." The word hit me harder than it should have. We followed him toward the porch, stepping carefully, even though the ground here felt solid, unmoving. But after what we'd just left on that ridge, the earth everywhere felt like a thin membrane stretched over something waiting to push through. Inside, the air was cooler but no less heavy. The old man shut the door behind us, locked it, then slid a rusted metal bolt I hadn't noticed earlier. The windows were already latched. Wooden slats were stacked against the hallway wall, ready to cover them. He had prepared for this, or for something like it. He turned, eyes burning. "Tell me exactly what you heard." Mason spoke first, voice shaking despite the effort he made to steady it. He described the hollow sound, the drag mark, the tap under the truck, the depression by the fence line. The old man didn't interrupt, didn't flinch, but his face paled slowly, like blood pulling inward. When Mason finished, silence stretched. The old man finally lowered himself into the chair near the table, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like he was holding something invisible together. "I knew the supports wouldn't hold forever," he said quietly, "but I hoped it would stay where it was." Something in that phrasing twisted my gut. Stay where it was? Not stay collapsed. Not stay sealed. Stay. Mason sank into the opposite chair. "Gramps, what is it? What's down there?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the old wooden floorboards beneath us as though listening for something. Then he inhaled slowly, like the truth itself tasted bitter. "It isn't a mine," he finally said. "Not the one I worked in. Not any of the shafts people think they've mapped. That hole goes deeper, much deeper. Older tunnels, older chambers." His voice dropped lower. "Not made by men." The words hit the room like a blow. Mason leaned forward. I stiffened, but not because of supernatural implications. I'd heard plenty of mining lore, old stories of strange hollows and natural caverns. But the old man wasn't talking like a storyteller. He wasn't being dramatic. He was giving a professional assessment. A warning. "I found it when I was your age," he continued. "I'd gone off trail, same as you. I felt the ground shift, heard the earth breathing. I knew to get off that ridge fast. Any miner would. Later, when I tried to report it, they said the land surveys didn't show anything unusual. No voids, no instability. They said I imagined it. But I knew what I'd heard." "What did you hear?" I asked softly. He swallowed. "Metal, but not picks, not tools. Something big, something moving in patterns." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. The look in his eyes said enough. Something about the memory unsettled him on a level far deeper than fear, a level that bordered on dread. Mason rubbed his forehead. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" His grandfather's face tightened. "Because once you know it's there, you go looking. Curiosity is worse than danger in these mountains." He looked directly at Mason. "And now you've woken it." A chill crawled across my arms. "We didn't touch anything. The ground just reacted." "It always reacts," the old man murmured. "It listens for disturbance. Wait, rhythm. It's been buried for longer than any mining record. But it knows movement. And once it feels it," he exhaled shakily, "it follows." The house creaked softly. Ordinary old house creaks. But in the moment, every sound felt loaded with meaning. We all froze, listening to the silence settle again. Mason finally broke it. "So what now? If it's following, how far does it go?" The old man's voice was barely above a whisper. "As far as it needs." Mason stood abruptly. "We have to warn people. The town. The rangers. Somebody." "No," his grandfather said immediately. "You warn them and they'll go looking. They'll send crews. Heavy machinery. The vibrations will draw it closer. Faster." I stepped toward the window, peeking through the thin space between the curtains. The yard was still. The sun was sharp and unforgiving. But something felt wrong. The kind of wrong that didn't require sight, just instinct. The soil near the fence line had darkened, like it had shifted. Recently. "Mason," I said quietly, "come here." He joined me at the window. His breath stopped in his throat. A slight rise had appeared in the dirt. Subtle, like the edge of something pushing up from below. Not enough to break the surface. Just enough to show where it was. Heading toward the house. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. Mason stumbled back. His grandfather slammed the wooden slats over the nearest window, hammering them in place with a speed that told me he'd rehearsed this moment in his mind for years. "We can't stay," I said. "If it's following pressure, the house won't protect us." "I know," the old man answered. "There's only one place it can't reach." He grabbed his coat, his hands trembling as he shoved his arms through the sleeves. Mason stared at him desperately. "Where?" "The old granite run," he said. "Bedrock thicker than anything in these hills. Solid enough to stop a cave-in. Solid enough to stop it." He paused at the door. "But we have to move now. Quietly. Step exactly where I step. And whatever happens." He looked at both of us with a severity that froze my blood. "Do not run." The old man opened the door just wide enough to slip through, then motioned sharply for us to follow. The afternoon sun poured in hot and blinding, making the outside world feel exposed and dangerous. I stepped out after Mason, carefully placing each foot where the old man had, on the hardened patches of earth, the compacted dirt that hadn't shifted. Mason's boots trembled slightly as he matched the old man's path. But he did it. Neither of us dared breathe loudly. The ground felt tense beneath us, like a drum pulled too tight. Even the smallest pebble crunch felt obscene, a violation that might call something to the surface. His grandfather led us across the yard, past the sun-bleached fence, toward a narrow side trail that wound between creosote bushes and brittle prickly pear. The path wasn't one I'd seen earlier. It was subtle, nearly invisible, worn in a way that suggested careful, deliberate use. It sloped upward toward a ridge behind the property, where pale granite outcrops jutted through the soil like vertebrae of the mountain. "That's where we're going?" I whispered. The old man nodded once. "The granite run," he murmured. "Pure bedrock, several yards thick. Nothing hollow beneath. Nothing for it to travel through." Behind us, a faint tremor rolled through the ground, so slight I might have dismissed it as imagination. But the old man stiffened. His jaw tightened. He didn't look back. "It's moving," he said. "Keep going." We obeyed. We moved quietly, the heat pressing down on us in heavy waves. Sweat blurred my vision, trickling into my eyebrows, but I didn't dare stop to wipe it. The old man's pace was steady, measured, the gait of someone who knew exactly which steps were safe. Every once in a while, he whispered, "Left," or "Step over," and we followed without question. The first real sign of danger came halfway up the ridge. A soft, sudden exhale beneath the soil. Not air, not wind. More like the pressurized sigh of earth releasing tension. The ground beneath my back foot sagged just a fraction. Just enough. I froze. "Don't move," the old man hissed. Mason glanced back, panic flaring in his eyes. "Danny, stay still," his grandfather said more sharply. I held my breath, foot half lowered, muscles screaming from the tension. Slowly, excruciatingly slowly, I lifted my heel and shifted all my weight onto the rock in front of me. The earth behind my other foot gave a tiny collapse, like a pocket of dust settling. It was only an inch, only a whisper of movement, but it shouldn't have moved at all. Mason's grandfather motioned us closer. We regained the path, inch by inch, until all three of us stood on the exposed granite. My legs trembled from the stress, but I kept as quiet as possible. We waited. 30 seconds. A minute. 2. The ground didn't shift again, but something beneath it adjusted. Faint, rhythmic vibration. Not moving toward us, just repositioning. Like it had sensed a disturbance but hadn't pinpointed the exact location. The old man whispered, "It's searching." Mason swallowed a dry, cracking breath. "For us. For movement. For weight. For everything above the tunnels." His voice shook for the first time since we'd arrived. "It listens to the earth." We climbed higher. Granite outcrops rose around us, the stone bright and sun-bleached, solid underfoot. The old man guided us along a narrow spine of bedrock until we reached a flat, wide slab overlooking the valley. From up here, the view opened completely. Mayor spread below, the desert shimmering in the distance, the Bradshaw Mountains rising behind us like a jagged shield. For the first time since we'd left the house, the ground felt unquestionably stable. Mason exhaled shakily. "We're safe here. For the moment," his grandfather said, scanning the yard below. But safety felt fragile, temporary. None of us trusted the silence. The heat radiating from the granite made the air shimmer in distorted waves. Then Mason's grandfather crouched, pressing his palm to the stone. His eyes closed. He wasn't praying. He was listening. The silence stretched. I heard nothing but my own heartbeat. Too loud, too fast, competing with the distant hum of heat waves. Finally, he stood. "It's near the house." Mason's face twisted. "How close?" The old man didn't answer with words. He pointed. From our vantage point, we could see the yard clearly, and near the fence line, the soil was heaving. Very gently, like something beneath it was sweeping upward in slow arcs, testing, pressing, probing. It didn't break the surface, but each swell traveled several feet before sinking again, creating ripples in the dirt like shallow waves in thick sand. Mason made a strangled sound. It followed us. All the way here. It followed disturbance. His grandfather corrected. It followed weight. It followed everything that's moved across that ridge for 100 years. He paused, then added bitterly, and it's faster now, more active. It must have been weakening the supports for decades. I forced the air out of my lungs. Then we call someone, the county, federal land management, a geological team. They won't know what to do, the old man said. They'll bring equipment. They'll drill. They'll send vibrations through the whole mountain. They'll wake it fully. So what do? Mason demanded. We can't just sit here and watch it crawl toward town. We're not going to watch, his grandfather said darkly. We're going to make sure it stays where it is. Mason stared at him. How the hell do we stop something underground? You don't stop it, the old man said. You anchor it. You isolate the hollow it uses. You cut off its path. You seal it with weight it cannot move. That's what we did the first time. I blinked. The first time. His grandfather looked at me with eyes hollowed by old fear. It broke through once, he said, before you or Mason was born. We didn't know what it was back then. Only that tunnels were collapsing in patterns, too symmetrical, too precise. Boys in town saw shapes in the brush. Livestock vanished without a trace. We found drag marks near the old ridge. He swallowed. We sealed the main chamber by collapsing the upper shaft. But it didn't die. It just stayed deeper. And now, Mason whispered, it's waking. The old man looked toward the moving soil. And we'll need more than 3 people to bury it again. The tremor beneath the yard intensified. The soil near the fence lifted 6 inches, then fell. Closer. Mason stepped back instinctively. We can't outrun that. We won't, the old man said. We're not running. We're redirecting. He turned to us with the weight of a man making a decision he'd dreaded his entire life. We're going back up the ridge. Mason stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Back? Why? We barely got off that mountain alive. The granite run protects us, his grandfather said. But if we want to stop it, we have to reach the old blasting site. The one with the charges still intact. My stomach dropped. You're talking about old dynamite from a century ago. Yes, he said. That's unstable. Dangerous. It could collapse the whole ridge. Yes, he repeated. Mason shook his head desperately. Gramps, you're 82. You can't. He cut him off sharply. We don't have a choice. It's moving toward the town, toward the homes, toward the school. His voice broke there just faintly. Then he looked at me. Danny, you know rock. You know stress points. You know load distribution. I can direct you to the chamber. But I need you to tell me where to set the charge. My mouth went dry. What if we're wrong? He answered without hesitation. Then the mountain collapses. And if we don't try? He stared down at the yard. As the earth lifted a full foot, we lose the town. The old man didn't wait for us to answer. The earth rising beneath his yard answered for us. The swell in the soil wasn't gentle anymore. It lifted in jerking pulses, like something below was adjusting its shoulders against the surface. Each heave pushed dirt outward in a halo, cracking the dry crust, sending tiny rivulets of dust sliding down the edges. I could practically feel the weight of it even from the granite outcrop. Mason made a soft, choked noise, something between disbelief and terror. His grandfather grabbed him by the shoulder, squeezing harder than someone his age should have been able. You listen to me, he said, voice low and urgent. This thing doesn't come up the way you're thinking. It doesn't claw out. It doesn't break through like rockfall. It moves the ground itself. You understand? It shifts what the earth rests on. That's why we can stop it. If we collapse the right place, if we bring down the load-bearing walls of its chamber, it'll seal itself under its own weight. Or bury half the ridge, I murmured. Better the ridge than the valley, he shot back. You know that. He was right. God help me, he was right. Mason swallowed hard. So what do we do? Just walk back up there and place explosives? Like we're some kind of demolition team? We don't need much, his grandfather said. Those old blasting caps are unstable. One good hit triggers everything within 50 yards. We only need to plant them. The ground will do the rest. I stared at him. You're talking about hiking across unstable soil carrying dynamite that might detonate from a sneeze. He met my eyes with the resignation of a man long past fear. That's why we're staying on the granite. And why you're coming. Because you can read rock. Because you'll know if we're standing above solid ground or above a coffin lid. Mason shook his head, rubbing both hands through his hair in panicked disbelief. Gramps, I don't want to lose you. His voice cracked with the weight of a child's fear, not a man's. We don't even know if this will work. The old man placed one weathered hand on Mason's cheek. Maze, I've been waiting 30 years for someone to help me do this right. I can't do it alone anymore, and you're the only blood I have left. I'd rather die stopping it than die hiding from it. Silence fell again. Not the comforting kind, but the held breath of a world bracing for something heavy. Finally, Mason nodded, not because he accepted the plan, but because he saw there was no alternative. I exhaled shakily and nodded too, though every nerve in my body rebelled. Fear isn't enough to stop you when you've already seen what the wrong choice does. We turned to start down the granite ridge when the ground below gave its most violent heave yet. Soil cracked outward like the surface of a slow-breaking wave. A sound followed, soft, deep, resonant. A low hum, not mechanical, not natural, like the resonance of something vast shifting against stone walls far below. The old man didn't panic, but he swore quietly under his breath. It's moving faster now. It knows we're out of reach, and it's looking for a way around the granite. It can't move through solid bedrock, right? Mason asked. Not fast, his grandfather replied, but tunnels run deep. It might find another passage. We don't have long. We began climbing, the granite slabs warm under our boots, each step echoing faintly in the stillness. The heat clung to us, thick and oppressive. 3 silhouettes ascending a ridge flanked by creosote and dust, with the valley behind us swallowing our footprints like it wanted them erased. Halfway up the outcrop, Mason stopped abruptly. Gramps! His grandfather halted and turned back. Mason lowered his voice. If we mess this up, if we collapse the ridge, if the whole thing slides, Myers on the other side, people, houses. We're not collapsing the ridge, the old man said. Just the chamber, the main chamber, the one I found decades ago. It's not under the town. It's under the ridge line, deep enough the blast won't breach upward. And if you're wrong, Mason whispered. His grandfather hesitated. Not long, but long enough I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. I'm not wrong, he said. I didn't know whether that was truth or faith. It didn't matter now. We reached a narrow pass where the granite thinned. The old man stopped, checking the ground with the heel of his boot. He moved like a man who had memorized every inch of this trail in secret, rehearsed it alone for years. This is the turn, he said. From here we stay to the left side. The right has shale beneath a thin crust, sink spots. We followed him left, edging along the ridge until a rusted metal object appeared among the rocks ahead. A collapsed wooden crate, half buried in dust. The old man knelt beside it, brushing debris away with trembling hands. Mason's breath hitched. "Is that? Been here since 46, his grandfather said. "The charges are deeper in, wrapped in tar, sealed against moisture. Dangerous as hell, but stable if we move slow." He reached into the crate and pulled back a burlap-wrapped bundle. It sagged in his hands as he lifted it, dust falling in powdery plumes. Even from several feet away, I felt my stomach twist. I knew enough about antique explosives to know how badly this could go. "Carry it with me," he said to me. "Not a request, a necessity. You take one side, I take the other. Mason, you take the caps. They're in the tin." Mason looked like he might faint. "You trust me with this?" His grandfather met his eyes with a steadiness that cut through the fear. "I trust you with my life." We moved. Slow, deliberate, silent except for breath and wind. The ridge narrowed. Ahead, the slope dipped into a shallow saddle between two granite outcrops. Beyond it lay the upper shelf, the one the old man had called the threshold, the place where, decades ago, he'd heard the first metallic movement beneath his boots. As we crossed into the saddle, the air shifted. Not temperature, not wind, a vibration, a pulse, small, subtle, like a heartbeat inside stone. Mason clutched the tin of blasting caps to his chest. "Gramps, it's under us." "No," his grandfather whispered. "Not close, just listening." We moved forward, step by step, until we reached the upper shelf overlooking the ridge. And the moment my boot touched the stone, the entire mountain answered. A deep, distant, resonant boom, like something massive had slammed against a hollow wall far below. The granite trembled, dust lifted. Mason gasped. "It knows," his grandfather whispered. His voice trembled, not with fear, but certainty. "It knows we're coming." The boom rolled through the ridge like thunder trapped in stone. Pebbles skittered across the granite shelf. A fine spray of dust lifted from the cracks and drifted in the air like pale smoke. I felt the sound in my bones more than in my ears. Something colossal had struck something hollow, deep beneath the surface, like a shoulder slamming into a cavern wall. Not blindly, testing, searching. Mason's grandfather tightened his grip on the burlap-wrapped dynamite bundle we carried between us. His jaw clenched, tendons standing out like cords under his skin. "Don't stop," he said. "It's closer than I hoped." We moved across the flat granite shelf toward the outcrop at the far end. Beyond that outcrop lay the threshold, where the old miner's exploratory shaft had once been, long since collapsed. Or so they believed. The old man had seen enough to know the truth. The collapse hadn't buried anything. It had just sealed the top of a void that was never meant to be opened. The mountain rumbled again. A low, heavy groan, longer than the boom this time. A dragging sound beneath the stone. Slow, grinding, like something massive shifting through a tight tunnel. Mason flinched so hard he nearly lost his grip on the tin of blasting caps. His grandfather snapped at him in a whisper sharp as broken glass. "Hold steady." "I'm trying," Mason hissed, voice trembling. "We're almost there," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The shelf curved around the ridge, narrowing to a ledge barely wider than my outstretched arms. The valley fell away to our right in a steep drop of brittle shale and dust. The dynamite felt heavier with every step, not because of the weight, but because of the knowledge of what one wrong slip would do. Not just to us, but to everyone below. The ground pulsed. A deep, rhythmic thud. Not footsteps. Not anything that belonged in a mine. Mason froze. "It's right under us," he whispered. No, his grandfather said, though his eyes flicked toward the granite beneath our feet. Not directly. It's in the subchamber, the largest hollow. It's testing the walls. Testing them for what? Mason breathed. I answered before his grandfather could. For weak points. He stared at me with widening terror. So, if it finds one, it will rise, the old man finished flatly. Now keep moving. We inched along the ledge until the granite swelled upward, forming a natural arch where the rock had split decades ago. The arch framed a narrow passage that cut deeper into the ridge. The air inside was cooler. Still. Too still. Sound didn't echo here, it died. As soon as we stepped beneath the arch, the mountain fell silent. All vibration ceased. No rumble. No pulse. Nothing. It was worse than the noise. The old man slowed, eyes sweeping the ground, the walls, the ceiling. It's listening, he whispered. This tunnel channels sound straight into the hollow. We must not slip. Not one rock. Not one scrape. The dynamite felt like a live animal in my hands. We moved with agonizing care, placing each foot in the old man's exact footsteps. The stone beneath us was smooth from decades of erosion, but it was solid, ancient bedrock, no shifting soil, no hidden crusts. Ahead, the passage widened into a chamber, open to the sky above, but bordered by fractured granite walls that leaned inward like a broken jaw. Rubble littered the center. Old beams, rusted metal scraps, the collapsed remnants of a structure long abandoned. The old staging area, the old man breathed. This is where the first crew lowered supplies. The chute down to the exploratory tunnel starts here. A shiver wormed up my spine. The chute. The old man approached a pile of collapsed timber at the far end of the chamber and kicked aside the debris. Beneath it, half buried under red dust, lay a circular opening. Not wide, maybe 3 feet across, reinforced with rotted planks, and utterly, blackly hollow. A cold draft rose from it, faint, metallic, like air that had passed over stone for centuries. Mason recoiled. We're not going down there. We don't have to, his grandfather replied. The chamber we need is directly under this ridge. We place the charges around the chute, enough to collapse the main column. The weight of the granite will take the rest. I crouched beside the opening. Cold air brushed my face, and I inhaled instinctively and froze. There was a sound, faint, far below, a dragging inhale, like something tasting new air. I jerked back so fast I scraped my hand on the granite. Mason saw my expression and went pale. What did you hear? Nothing, I lied. We need to hurry. The old man unwrapped the dynamite. Each stick was sealed in tar-coated paper, the fuses long removed. The blasting caps would do the work. He handed me the first stick. Set it in the rock gap there. Deep. Don't let it tilt. My hands shook as I wedged the dynamite stick into the fracture. Mason knelt beside me, placing 2 more where I directed. 1 on each side of the chute, angled downward to maximize downward concussive force. We worked fast but careful. 1 stick. 3, 5, 7. The tin shook in Mason's hands as he opened it. Inside lay a cluster of ancient blasting caps, rusted metal tips with thin wires curled like dead vines. They looked older than the house his grandfather lived in. This is insane, Mason whispered, handing one to his grandfather. Living long enough to regret it is insane, the old man said. Dying because you were too afraid to act is worse. He pressed the first cap into the end of a dynamite stick. The metal sank into the tar paper with a soft crack. Not enough to trigger it, but enough to make my blood run cold. We inserted the caps carefully, 1 by 1. For caps, 6, 10. When we reached the 11th, a tremor rolled through the chamber. Dust drifted from the arch overhead. The granite floor vibrated. Not a pulse this time, but pressure, as if something below had grown impatient. The old man whispered, "It's climbing." Mason looked at him in horror. Climbing where? His grandfather pointed at the chute. The main tunnel runs below this ridge. It's rising toward the largest void, toward the place where the collapse was strongest, the place where the rock is thinnest. I looked at the chute, that black, circular mouth, and for the first time, something moved, too slow to define, too deep to see clearly. But the darkness shifted. Not shadow, mass, a shape, rising. Mason choked on a sound that wasn't even a scream. "Gramps, we're out of time," his grandfather said. "Danny, your signal." My throat constricted. "We need distance." "Yes, enough that the shock wave doesn't kill us." He pointed toward the arch back to the granite run. "Now." We scrambled toward the passage, boots slipping on rubble. The mountain rumble grew heavier, closer. Dust rose in clouds. The chute groaned, and from far below, 3 metallic taps echoed upward. Not random, not settling. A warning, or a challenge. We slid beneath the arch. The old man turned back toward the dynamite, breath ragged. A final tremor rolled through the chamber, so deep it rattled my teeth. "Danny!" he shouted. "Now!" I slammed the detonator wire against the granite and prayed the caps were still conductive after 70 years. The mountain held its breath. Then, somewhere deep below us, a massive, concussive thud struck the earth like the heartbeat of a dying beast. Not yet the explosion. Not yet. Something else had hit first. Something that knew we were trying to bury it. The concussive thud from beneath us wasn't the explosion. It was deeper, heavier, too organic. It reverberated up the chute like something enormous had slammed itself against the far wall of the cavern, shaking the ridge to warn us one last time. A sound that felt less like force and more like intent. Mason stumbled as the ground shifted sideways under our feet. His grandfather caught him with one hand while gripping the jagged granite with the other. "Run!" the old man barked. "Back to the granite run. It'll follow the vibrations. Go!" We sprinted. The passage we'd crept through so cautiously now felt too small, too slow, too close to the thing climbing the earth beneath us. Dust poured from the stone like smoke as the mountain trembled. Each rumble grew louder, closer, reverberating through the rock as if the ridge itself was becoming the instrument of something rising. Mason held the tin of blasting caps against his chest, gasping. I clutched the wire, praying the primitive circuit would hold long enough to ignite. We burst through the arch onto the ledge. The old man shoved us forward. "Down the slope, careful. Stay on the spine." Behind us, a sound rose from the tunnel. Not a roar, not a screech, something worse. A grinding inhale, like stone being pulled through a narrow throat. Something slipping out of a space not built for its size. A shifting mass. Presence. The air turned colder as it emerged. We ran along the granite ridge. The world narrowed to heat, breath, sunlight flashing off stone. The vibrations underfoot growing sharper, more violent. Dust rose behind us in a plume. Then an impact. A deep, catastrophic boom from behind us. Not the explosion. Not yet. The chute itself had buckled under pressure. The old man swore, "It's breaking through the shaft." We didn't look back. Looking back felt like inviting it to see us. The granite run ahead shimmered in the sun. Our one sanctuary. A long, exposed spine of bedrock, smooth and pale. No soil, no voids, nothing to rise through. Mason reached it first, stumbling to his knees. I grabbed his arm and pulled him farther onto the slab. The old man was slower. He was strong, but his age showed now. He climbed the ridge, breath ragged, legs shaking. A crack split the earth behind him, a long, jagged fracture ripping across the shale like a zipper, and something beneath moved toward it. Not fast, not human. A wave of soil bulged upward, racing beneath the crust. Mason screamed, "Gramps, hurry! I'm coming!" He rasped, forcing himself up the last few feet. We pulled him onto the granite run just as the earth behind him heaved upward in a violent swell. Soil cracked and fell away into a darkening cavity below. A cavern had grown too close to the surface. The ridge trembled with the weight of it. The old man didn't stop. He staggered to me and grabbed my wrist, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises. "Danny, now, detonate, before it gets above the chamber." I swallowed. "Once I do this, there's no going back." "There wasn't going back the moment you heard it," he said. I knelt on the granite slab, bracing the wire connector against the stone. My hands shook. Mason hovered beside me, his breath sawing in and out like someone drowning in air. The old man stood watch over the crumbling ridge. The ground behind him heaved again. Something in the darkness pressed upward, testing the crust like a finger through paper. This was our one chance. If it breached the upper ridge, there would be no directing it, no stopping it. It would move beneath the valley, following roads, homes, vibrations, everything living. I pressed the wire to the metal ring. One spark, a single, tiny, pitiful spark, and then a distant click. Not the tap of before. Cap igniting, then another, then all of them, a chain ripping down into the chute, fire racing through ancient dust, a flicker, far below, like lightning in a dead sky, and then the mountain exploded. A hollow, bone-shaking roar tore through the ridge. Heat burst upward in a violent shockwave. The ground convulsed under our feet. I grabbed the granite with both hands just as the old staging chamber collapsed inward, stone crashing into the void in an avalanche of earth and noise. A pillar of dust blasted out of the archway behind us, slamming against my back like a wall of sand. Mason was thrown onto his side, coughing. The old man stayed on his feet only because he braced against a boulder. The ridge buckled. The ledge nearest the chute split and dropped 10 feet in an instant. A cascade of debris fell into the collapsing chamber. The roar intensified, like the earth was screaming. But beneath the chaos, something else screamed back. A sound too deep to be anything living on the surface. Too massive, too furious. A creature losing the space around it. Losing the tunnels. Losing the void. A creature being buried alive. The mountain swallowed the noise, stone crushing inward as the chamber's load-bearing walls gave way. The earth collapsed in concentric waves, each tremor smaller than the last, until the ridge stabilized again. Dust hung in the air like fog. Silence. A long, aching silence broken only by the soft patter of settling debris. Mason coughed violently, spitting grit. Did we do it?" The old man didn't answer. He stared at the remains of the ridge with an expression I couldn't read. I pushed myself upright, lungs burning, and scanned the mountain. The swell in the soil had vanished. The fracture had stopped widening. No rumble, no vibration, no movement beneath the earth. Just the stillness of a mountain that had taken something back into itself. The old man finally exhaled, a single trembling breath. "It won't reach the surface again. Not after that weight. Not for another 100 years." Mason wiped his face, streaking dust across his cheek. 100 years. That's all we bought. That's more than most people get. his grandfather said quietly. More than we had this morning. I stood fully, legs shaking, hands raw and trembling. The wind finally picked up, carrying dust down the ridge like scattered ashes. Should we tell someone? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, the old man said. They won't believe it. And if they do, they'll dig. They'll investigate. They'll open what we just sealed. Mason nodded shakily. So we just pretend today didn't happen? His grandfather looked at him with something like sorrow. No, you remember it. You remember it so you never go near that ridge again. You remember it so your kids never do. And you remember it because someday someone will hear the ground again. Maybe far after we're gone. And they'll need to know what it means. A long gust of wind swept the ridge, tearing dust from the collapsed slope and scattering it across the granite run, erasing the last signs of the struggle beneath us. Mason leaned against me, exhausted. Danny, do you hear anything now? I listened. The wind, the distant hum of a highway, a bird crying out somewhere far below. But beneath the earth, nothing. I shook my head. It's quiet. The old man closed his eyes, relief softening the lines carved by fear. He placed one hand on the granite and whispered almost too softly to hear, "And let it stay that way." We stood together on the bedrock until the sun began to lower behind the Bradshaw Mountains, the ridge casting its long shadow over the valley. The mountains slept again, and I prayed, God, I prayed, it wouldn't wake in my lifetime.